In this video, we're going to be talking about arrays. Now, arrays are very fun to work with in JavaScript. So let's get right to it. Okay, so first of all, what are arrays? How do they look like? And what do we do with them? Now, arrays are a type of objects that lets you store multiple values at the same time in a single variable. So previously, we knew that variables could contain numbers, they could contain strings, booleans, and a lot of other things. But number strings, booleans, they can contain only one value at one time. So variable a can equal a single string or a single number or a single boolean, but they can't contain multiple booleans or multiple values, numbers, or strings at the same time. That's why we have arrays. Arrays allow us to store multiple values at the same time in a list-like object in a single variable so that they stay together and they can be used in much more efficient ways. This is how an array looks like. So this is how you declare and create an array. We're using the array literal syntax, where you type in the values of the array. In this case, we have three values or three elements or items inside this array. The first item or first element is the string red. Then we have the string green, and then we have the string blue. We separate these elements by a comma, and we wrap this whole thing up in a pair of square brackets. That's how we create an array. So whenever you see a square bracket at the start and end of a list of values, that is an array. Now, arrays can contain much more than strings. They can contain numbers, booleans, and even other things. For example, here's a more complex array. So as you can see, in this array, the first value, car, is a string. The second value, separated by a comma, is 34, a number. Then the third value, if you look correctly, is actually another array. So you can actually have an array as an element in another array. So you're basically nesting an array inside another array. And in this array, we also have two other elements. So the nested array contains the value 2 and also math.random, which executed will give us a random number. And finally, the fourth value is true. So as we can see that arrays can contain a lot of different types of values, even other arrays inside them, effectively creating nested multi-level arrays. Now oftentimes you'll actually be assigning an array to a variable because an array without assigning it to a variable is not very useful. So oftentimes you'll declare a variable and assign an array as its value. So in this case we have the variable named food and equals an array. And this array contains three elements. The first is a string meat, then the string fish, and then the string vegetables. So the var food equals an array which contains three elements. Now you can also create arrays in a different fashion. You can use the new array constructor. So if you want an array with three items, 1, 2, and 3, then you can do so using the new array constructor. In this case, you have to type in new array, and then inside the parentheses, you have to define all the elements as parameters. So in this case, new array 1, 2, 3 creates a new array object with elements 1, 2, and 3. However, this is not very efficient. Just like the new string, new number, and new boolean examples, you should try to avoid using new array. Just use the array literal syntax like we have in the first examples. New array is not very optimized and it's not very performance friendly. So avoid using it whenever you can. Now, an array is actually an object. In fact, like we said in the very first videos, that almost everything in JavaScript is an object, which means numbers are objects, strings are objects, booleans are objects, and of course, the arrays themselves are objects. So if you type in the type of operator, then type of food, remember the food variable contains the array, then type of food equals object, because an array is an object. However, if you want to find out whether a value is an array or not, you can use the isArray method of the array object. So you can type in array.isArray, and then inside the parentheses, you can type in the array to test. In this case, array.isArray food equals true, because food is definitely an array. So you can use the isArray method in order to check whether a value is an array or not. Now after creating an array, you must be able to access the individual elements inside that array. Otherwise, it won't be very useful. There are ways of accessing and retrieving the elements of an array. Here's how it's done. So first, let's have a variable food again and assign it the array with 3 items. The 3 elements will be 3 strings: meat, fish, and vegetables. And this is the array that's the value of the variable food. Now, how do we access the individual elements inside this array? You can use the bracket syntax in order to access these elements. This works kind of like this. So whenever we create an array, every single element or item inside that array is assigned an index number. The very first element inside an array has an index 0. The second element has an index 1. The third element has an index 2, all the way up to the last element. So you can use this index number with the bracket notation in order to access the individual items inside an array. So if you type in food and then square brackets, and inside the square brackets you specify the index number, in this case 0, which means the first element, it retrieves the first element, which is in this case meat. So that is how you can access and retrieve the different elements inside an array. You can use the index number of that element in order to retrieve the value. Similarly, if you want to retrieve the second element, you need to type in food and then 1 inside square brackets. Now index 1 is actually the second element because indexes start at 0. 0 is the first element and 1 is the second element. So food and 1 in square brackets means you're accessing the second element inside the array. So food 1 equals fish because that's the second element. And of course, food 2, which means the third element, equals vegetables. So this is how you can access the individual items inside an array. Now let's take a look at a more complex example. So here we have a complex array that we just saw a few slides back. So var a equals car34 and another array which equals 2 and math.random, and finally the boolean true as the last element. So this is a very complex array. It contains numbers, strings, booleans, and even other arrays inside it. So how do you access the different elements? Well, the syntax is pretty much the same. So the first element has the index 0. So a in square brackets 0 means we're accessing the first element. In this case, the first element is car. The string car is retrieved when we type in a0 in square brackets. Similarly, 1 means the second element because the second element has the index 1. So a in square brackets 1 retrieves 34 because that is the second element. Now here's where things get interesting. Now a in square brackets 2 means we're retrieving the third element. Now the third element inside this array is actually another array with 2 different elements. So when you type in a square brackets 2, it retrieves the third element. Now the third element is an array itself, so it just retrieves the array. It makes sense, right? Because a square brackets 2 means we're accessing the third element. Third element is an array. Now because we have math.random, the array contains the value 2 and a random number. Now in this case, the array might look like 2, a random number in an array. So this is the third element inside the array. And of course, a square bracket 3 means the last element or the fourth element, which is the boolean true. Now remember, a square bracket 2, which means the third element, is actually an array itself, which means you can actually use the square bracket notation again, nesting it on top of each other to access the individual elements inside the nested array as well. So a20 means we're first retrieving the array, the third element, the array, and then we're accessing the first element, the 0 index of that array. So it retrieves 2. 2 is the first element of the nested array. So by using the double square bracket notation, you can actually access the individual elements inside a nested array. So a square brackets 2 means the third element, which is the array itself, and then 0 means the first element of that nested array, which is 2. And of course, a21, which means the third element of the array A, which is a nested array, and then square brackets 1 means the second element inside the nested array, which is the random number. In this case, it can be something like 0.453 and so on. So this is how you can use nested arrays and access the elements inside the nested arrays by nesting and doubling square brackets. Now, when working with nested arrays, remember not to go too deep and complex. Arrays that don't have any nested arrays in them are called one-dimensional arrays. Arrays that have one level of nested arrays inside them are called two-dimensional arrays. So the array in this example is a two-dimensional array because it has one array and another array inside it. Now, if there's another array inside this array, it's called a three-dimensional array. And then if you have another array inside that array, it will be a four-dimensional array. Now you can go on, but you have to remember not to go too deep. Most of the time you'll be working with one-dimensional arrays. Sometimes you might need to use two-dimensional arrays, and that's okay. In very complex examples, you might use three-dimensional arrays, but anything over than 4 or 5-dimensional arrays gets very, very complex and too hard to manage, so don't go that far. So now that we know how to access the different elements inside an array, how do we manipulate arrays themselves? So what if we want to change one element or delete it? How do we do that? Well, let's take a look. So first, again, we'll have a simple variable food, which equals an array that contains 3 items, meat, fish, and vegetables, all strings. Now, of course, as we learned from the previous slide, food square brackets 1 means we're accessing the element with index 1. Index 1 means the second element, which retrieves fish. Now, if you want to change the value of the second element, you can actually assign it a different value. So food square bracket 1 means the second element, or the element with index 1, and you can assign it a different value. For example, instead of fish, we can assign it equals bread. And now if you type in food, as you can see, the element has been changed. So now it's no more meat, fish, vegetables, it's meat and then bread and vegetables. So just like you can use the index and the square bracket notation to access array elements, you can use it to change and manipulate the array values themselves. Now, when manipulating arrays, you must be careful that you always manipulate elements that actually exist, unless you're specifically doing it for some other reason. So for example, here we have a variable n, and it equals an array. This array has 3 values, 1, 2, and 3, with index numbers specifically 0, 1, and 2. We have 3 elements ranging from index 0 to 2. Now, if we type in n square bracket 5 equals 4, which means we're accessing the element with index 5 and assigning it a value 4. Now, an element with index 5 doesn't actually exist because the array only has 3 elements, right? So we have indexes 0, we have index 1, and we have index 2. Index 5 is so far away. It doesn't actually exist yet, but we can nonetheless assign a value to it. So n square bracket 5 equals 4 means we'll add an element in the array with index 5 and a value 4. However, this leaves undefined elements inside the array. So now if you type in n, it actually looks like this. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's actually 1, 2, 3, undefined, undefined, and then 4. Why is that? That's because in the second statement, we typed in n square bracket 5. Now index 5 means the 6th element. So the 6th element inside this array will have the value 4. Now we didn't define what the 4th and 5th element will be, so they're automatically undefined. So that's why if you use a very high index number, you'll actually end up with undefined values inside the array, which might cause problems later on. So be careful with this.